The Things They Carried by Christian Cooley and Sam Weirda. Introduction. While we first read about this major idea in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, there are many accounts of the Vietnam War in which this idea of coping mechanisms can be seen. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers used many different forms of coping mechanisms as seen in The Things They Carried. These men were forced to find new ways to deal with the stress and horrors of the war. It was not physically possible for the soldiers to carry anything else with them, but if it was a necessity, they found a way. Coping mechanisms were a necessity to survive the war. Tim O'Brien is the main character, but also a version of Tim O'Brien invented by the author. He receives his draft notice in the summer of 1968 and is faced with the biggest choice of his life. Does he do the honorable thing and report for war, or does he not face his fears and run to Canada? Unable to take the pressure, O'Brien faces his fears and brings a new sense of shame with him to Vietnam. Throughout the book, we see many ways that he, along with his buddies, and how they cope with the stressfulness of war. Other members of Alpha Company use personal effects to remain connected to something outside the war, as well as find comfort for themselves. Dobbins carried a pair of his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck each time he went into battle. Each person in the world had something different, and this was Dobbins' way. Ted Lavender carried tranquilizers, 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, which for him was a necessity, and this was Ted Lavender's way of coping with the war. Introduction continued. They carried the common secret of cowardice barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide, and in many respects this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down, and it required perfect balance and perfect posture. They all knew they carry fear. They always know everyone around them does as well. It is interesting because they don't talk about it in this book. Their fear of weakness in physical or moral is their heaviest burden. It's something that's always on their minds. I survived, but it's not a happy ending. I was a coward. I went to the war. Usually you think that cowards run from war, but O'Brien calls himself one for going there in the first place. He let his shame and fear win over his principles. For O'Brien, the strong thing to do would have been to run away, but instead he went. So, the book. War can be enough to drive a person to insanity, causing them to need something that brings them back to the reality of this world. This item is usually personal. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross had thoughts about his girlfriend, Martha, ever since he left for war. He would always read her letters from her and wondered about her. This was his tactic to keep him connected to the real world. At one point during the war, Martha sent Jimmy Cross a stone from the shoreline of Jersey. This was another small connection to the life that him and Martha used to live, in which he wanted to someday return. He had memories of walks they used to take together, and Jimmy Cross was able to let go of a few of the burdens of war when he had this pebble. This small item was a physical connection to the life to which he was planning to return to someday, and it gave Jimmy the strength, support, and sanity in the war. Jimmy was faced to lead his unit every day in battle, and he was forced to carry the real weight more than any other person in his platoon. This weight that he carried was both emotional and physical. Jimmy still found a place for these letters with the pebble. There were necessary items for him to remember his purpose in fighting the war, and therefore he needed them just as much as ammunition, food, or clothing. The book continued. There are many different scenarios in the book in which we saw fear. In the book, it talks about the things they carried with them. While they all carry physical loads, they also carry heavy emotional loads, composed of many different things, but the main thing being fear. Each man's physical burden underscores his emotional burden. Facing the heavy burden of fear, the men in the book do not want to because they are scared that might ruin their reputations. Every member of the team experiences fear at some point in the book, but they know that showing fear will only reveal their vulnerability. O'Brien showed he was very fearful about going to Vietnam in the beginning of the book because he talks about it with his thoughts about going to Canada. When we see O'Brien kill his first man in the war, he states how terrified he was. The young man on the trail was no danger to O'Brien. He had no idea O'Brien was there. O'Brien killed him not because of morality or politics, but because he was generally terrified and weak. So, article: A Soldier's Heart. For someone to survive the war, the war needs to seem appropriate to them. Killing, fighting, and death all needs to be okay when the time comes, even if their ethical self does not think the same. Leaders have to be supportive, and they need to be there for their troops. After reading an article from PBS, David Grossman says the things that need to be put in place: number one is stress inoculation ahead of time, mental preparation. What he is saying is that you need to be ready for what's to come, and you need to know what you have to do and the coping mechanisms you will use when the war gets heated. Grossman also states all of these things needed to be understood ahead of time. The whole toolbox of coping mechanisms and psychological preparation needs to be given ahead of time. This quote really pulls everything together from the things they carried and this article for my topic. In the things they carried, each person has a toolbox per se. From this, they had things like pantyhose, rocks, Bibles, letters, and anything that kept them sane during the war. Along with the soldiers in the book, this also is the case in real life. The soldiers of Vietnam did things to keep reality and terror at the war at bay in their minds. This article is called A Soldier's Heart. Next article is The Psychological Effects. After reading The Psychological Effects of Vietnam War from Stanford EDU, I realized fear was a major part of the war. For many Americans, the Vietnam War is long over and forgotten. Among the still suffering are veterans who have felt forgotten and unappreciated. After reading this article and reflecting over the book, I found out there are many fears of coming home as well, not just being in the war. You find yourself alone, no one to talk to. No one here understands what you went through besides those who were there with you at the time. Being exposed to all the stress, confusion, anxiety, pain, and hatred at such a young age changes people. Returning, you were portrayed as to the public as a crazed psychopathic killer with no morals or control over your aggression. You had to live in fear that the loved ones around you wouldn't look at you the same. In the book, we see that Tim is afraid to go into war. This is showed through the chapters in which he runs to the border of Canada and spends his days on end thinking about if he was going to face his fears or run away from them. So, here are some photographs. This is for the coping mechanisms. The first picture is a soldier with a letter from home. This is one of the way that he coped with the war and kept himself sane. And another coping mechanism was smoking. Over 80% of the soldiers smoked. Photographs. Here's a photograph about fear. Both of these. In the first one, there's a lot of fear whether they were going to live or die, and they were trying to save many people, but they couldn't save them all. In the second photograph is an injured soldier, and they had the fear of dying or living every day. So here is a documentary about coping mechanisms.
This is Fire Support Base Aries, 50 miles northeast of Saigon. Vito is a 20-year-old draftee from Philadelphia. A photographer before he entered the Army, Vito is now a squad leader, responsible for the lives of a dozen men.
Well, it's a 12-gauge shotgun. What we basically use it for on the LZ and I guess even out in the field, so if you want to know, is that we use the shotgun from a ball. You know, you just put the ball in a chamber and all. Paul, let me borrow that ball from you. This is probably all SIDS and we're getting busted, but I don't care.
Shotgun. What's happening here is also happening to some extent at virtually every other American installation in Vietnam. Recent surveys estimate that well over 50% of the soldiers in Vietnam use marijuana.
You get really stoned. Then, who cares about the war? This war.
So that was a documentary about coping mechanisms. And that was smoking marijuana was one of the ways that they coped with the war. And as you heard the soldier speak, you could hear him talk about how it just made him forget about the war. So now we move on to our next documentary, and this one is about fear, and it portrays the fighting in the war really well in a modern sense. So. So that was a documentary about fear, and even though it doesn't say anything, I kind of think the video kind of explains itself. And then finally is our interview. And in the first part, it's going to talk about my grandfather getting drafted into the Army. The second part, it's going to talk about fear. And in the third part, it's going to talk about coping mechanisms, all three of our topics.
Oh, cool. So, but the last night I was getting concerned, I shut it off. So, anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so my first question is, did you get drafted?
Say that again.
Did you get drafted into the...
Yes, I was drafted in the United States Army back in 1966.
Okay.
And I did not want to go into the Army because everybody was going to Vietnam. And so the Navy Seabees had a special program at that time, back in 66, for people who were in construction to apply to go into the Navy and be Seabees, which is the construction battalion of the Navy. So I qualified for that. So that's when I went in. Well, guess what? I took all my basic training, all my survival training, and weapons training, and all kinds of training. And anyway, I was in Vietnam before, actually, if I would have went the Army.
Okay.
Anyway, that's how that happened. That's how I got into the Navy Seabees.
Alright.
Versus the Army, being which I was drafted in. In order to get in the Navy Seabees, I also had to leave the day before. I would have had to go into the draft, get on the bus out of Kalamazoo to be in the Army.
Alright. My next question is did you have any fear about going into it?
Say that again.
Did you have any fear about what you were getting into when you got drafted?
Well, certainly. You don't know what's going to happen. You have not a clue. It's all new because this is the thing. They drafted Mary and only 3 months in Kalamazoo County, and that's where I got into it. You must remember, I was married for 5 years already.
Yeah.
We had just built a brand new home, and there was total fear. Leaving here, leaving my family, my wife, everybody else, and going to destinations unknown.
Yeah.
And I had not a clue, so definitely there is fear. And of course, being in Vietnam, there's even more.
Yeah. So in our book that we've been reading, the main character ran away to get away from the draft. Did you know anyone like this that had, or?
I'm going to say in Kalamazoo area, I personally did not know any draft dodgers.
Okay.
I did not. That buzzed over to Canada. I know there were lots of them, and there were lots of conscientious objectors. There was people all over the creation. But, see, this is where the war was really starting to escalate. They weren't as many at that moment. It was back after 67, 68. That's when they really started getting that way. So that's when the whole business changed and went up in smoke.
Yep.
That's to mean it that way, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Everybody was against the war back then, by 69, so.
Yep. All right. My second question is during the war, what did you do to cope with everything that was going on?
Keep yourself extremely busy.
Yeah.
That's what we had to do. You got to remember, we were in construction, so we worked, in the morning, got up early and had lunch, breakfast, and worked all day and stuff like that. And at night, just relaxed. I guess I'm going to use those words as relaxed. That is not correct, but I'm saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Just play cards and stuff. Independent if we were on alerts, of course, and alerts were every 2, 3, 4 days, and that's when you end up staying up half the night. But
Yeah.
just to defend yourself and the people. So, basically, it's from one day to the next. You don't know.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything specifically that you remember what other people did to cope with the war? Or was it just all the same?
Very similar, but some people lack faith. Faith is a very important thing, and the people.
Alright, so that was our interview, and then here's our conclusion. After reading this book, we can see how both topics that were covered, fear and coping mechanisms, were both a huge part in the Vietnam War. We feel like the way this book portrayed the war and the way the soldiers deal with it and felt is very accurate from all of our research. All in all, this was a very interesting project, and we both learned a lot from it. So, Christian, me, I did coping mechanisms, and Sam did fear. So, that's our project. Thank you.